Maybe you've heard that magnesium is amazing for blood sugar, for sleep, for anxiety, and maybe you're taking a magnesium. But chances are you may be taking a magnesium that is poorly absorbed. You may be taking a magnesium that actually isn't an effective dose. So the dose is really, really important. And oftentimes the blends of magnesium are not all we think that they are cracked up to be. And magnesium is not only important for sleep and anxiety, but as I mentioned, it's hugely important for our blood sugar and for insulin resistance. And today we are going to speak with Barb Woegerer. She is a naturopathic doctor, and she does this deep dive on magnesium. And I was nerding out the whole time because this is a supplement that I recommend a lot of people take. And a lot of you perhaps are taking a magnesium supplement, and our soils are just so depleted that it is actually really hard to get all the magnesium that we need from just diet alone. We do talk about different food sources of magnesium. We talk about all different forms of magnesium, which ones are good for which things. We also talk about how many enzymatic processes that magnesium is involved in our body, and the number is going to blow you away. And we talk about the things that deplete magnesium. So we actually burn through magnesium really fast when certain things are happening and due to certain things that we consume. So this episode absolutely blew my mind, and I feel so happy to know all this information so I can make better recommendations to my clients. So a little bit more about Dr. Barb before we dive in. I'm going to read her bio. She's a licensed naturopathic doctor practicing in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and she's passionate about empowering people to take control of their own health. And her primary focus is to explore the underlying root cause and provide individualized, patient-centered care. She utilizes evidence-based therapies and provides patients with the knowledge and tools they need to succeed. Her clinical focus is in women's health, stress management, and inflammatory conditions. Hint, hint, magnesium is great for those things. And Dr. Barb spends a great deal of time educating individuals on the importance of magnesium and why we all need to add this mineral to our health toolbox. When she's not seeing patients, she loves spending time in nature, reading and experimenting with new recipes in the kitchen. You can find her on Instagram at Dr. Barb Woegerer, where she shares a wealth of information on magnesium and inflammation. So make sure you follow her there. And her last name is Woegerer. It's not like it sounds. And you see this written, so you'll see her name there. So make sure you guys go follow her on Instagram, and her website is drbarbwoegerer.com. You will love the information that she is putting out there, and you are going to love this interview with Dr. Barb. So stick around. It's an amazing episode. You're not going to want to miss it. Dr. Barb, I am so happy to welcome you onto the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, and I am so excited to be here.
Yeah, I am so excited to talk about this topic. Ever since I saw your Instagram, I'm like, I need to get her on my podcast because I recommend magnesium to all my clients. I take it myself. Everyone's, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, and I'm taking a magnesium. Like, people know sort of to take magnesium, and then I think we're taking it. I'm still deficient. Like, it's a mysterious mineral, I guess we'll put it that way. So I'd love to start with your story about how you got interested in magnesium.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, magnesium is something I talk a lot about. So how I got started was when I first went into practice as a naturopathic doctor. I'm in Toronto, Ontario. So we have healthcare that is not privatized. And so when we go to the doctor, we pay for our healthcare through our taxes, but there's no big expense that comes out, or we don't need to have insurance. So what I was seeing was people coming in as like the last resort coming to see me. And so they had gone to doctors, they had gone to specialists, and they had, kind of resourced out all of their avenues, and they kind of ended up in my office. And then they were like, well, what can you do to help me? And I had these cases that were just like, I didn't know where to start. I was like, oh my goodness. So I would do all this research, and almost every single time I was researching these complex cases, there was always this: make sure they're not magnesium deficient, make sure that the magnesium is optimized because it's needed to function in this capacity or in this enzyme reaction. And so I was starting to do these N of 1 studies with these patients, and I would send them home, and literally all that I would have given them was magnesium. And I might have dosed it a little bit higher, thinking that maybe we could see some results. And when they would report back to me in 2-3 weeks, they'd be like, I don't know what you just gave me. This has really improved, and this has and I was like, oh my goodness. So I started like recording a lot of this stuff just on the side, more so for me than anything else. And about a year afterwards, I was like, okay, there's something about this mineral, and we need to like kind of do more deep dives. And so I started to get like really into the research and really looking at what this mineral was all about. Because trust me, we did not talk about it in school at all. I mean, we talked about minerals in like a capacity of, yes, there's minerals, but we never like talked about a single mineral or what it was or where it was active in the body. And so that is kind of how my story started with magnesium. And I was like, you know what? And like when I started promoting magnesium, not very many people were talking about magnesium. And so I was like, okay, well, they got to learn about this mineral.
Awesome. So what makes it so important and spectacular, and like why is it so helpful for so many different conditions?
Yeah, so the most important part I think that we have to understand with magnesium is that it's responsible for over 600 enzymatic reactions. And so what that means is that the majority of the body's vital enzymes rely on magnesium to function. So it's either a coenzyme or a cofactor to a lot of different biochemical reactions, enzymatic reactions in the body. And so it has its hands in everything. It's not like in one specific part of the body, it's like everywhere. And so when we see a mineral that has that type of role, we have to make sure that people have enough of it, because unfortunately we see a huge deficiency in this mineral because it's depleted so easily. And so we have to make sure that people actually have enough, and that people are either, making sure to consume magnesium-rich foods or getting in through supplementation. But if we want proper functioning of the body, we need to have magnesium. And we know magnesium is really good for stress and sleep. I think that's kind of been put out there for sure. But it's good for bone health. It activates vitamin D, right? So you wonder why we have such a high vitamin D deficiency in the population. Well, magnesium deficiency is really high too, and they need each other in order to be activated. So yes, you can take activated vitamin D, but your liver and kidneys still need magnesium in order to make that vitamin D work in the body. And we know that it does all kinds of things with heart health and brain and moods and all of these things. So it's not just the sleep and stress that it's kind of like talked about a lot. It does a lot of other processes. And so a lot of times people are diagnosed with certain health conditions, and when you look at all the symptoms of magnesium deficiency or somebody who doesn't have enough magnesium, a lot of those symptoms fall under those health conditions. And so they're just blindly kind of diagnosed with one of these conditions. And usually if we target further down what's going on, we see that magnesium can be really helpful.
Wow. Okay. So I have so many questions are just popping into
Yeah.
my mind. So I just wanted to start with, you gave a really good example of how when you talked about like magnesium being a important for enzymatic reactions, for people who are like me, not scientists, like can you give some examples beside like you gave one with the vitamin D? So just so we can start like really conceptualizing the importance, because I think that we can hear that and we're like, oh, it's important for everything. But if we can like latch on to a few examples, it really helps make it like, oh, this is really important, right?
Right. So if we look at even just bone health, right? So
Uh-huh.
yes, we need calcium. Yes, we need vitamin D and we need magnesium. But the reason we need magnesium is because if you want to get that calcium to the bone, you need a breakdown of that calcium and you need to have it move to the bone. And so magnesium does that, right? So these are all these little actions. Or if we're using magnesium in the brain, for instance, it actually sits on the GABA receptor and triggers that in order to release mood calming properties, or it could even like induce sleep or things like that. So it's a lot of biochemistry. It happens in the background. There's usually 3 or 4 different steps, but vitamin D, it's happening in the liver and the kidney, so you can see the complexities of that. And when there's like 600, that means that usually any process that you are like that your body has to do in a daily sense is being operated by magnesium.
Wow. Yeah, that is super helpful. So it gives us some of these concrete examples and yeah, seeing how it's like, oh, if the magnesium isn't there, this step can't happen. And so you started to talk about how it's so related to so many things. Obviously, it's like our blood sugar. Our blood sugar affects every single cell, organ, and process in our body. And same thing with magnesium because it's needed for so many different um, reactions and processes to happen. We're going to see widespread, probably different for everybody, a different type of pattern if there is deficiency. Is that right? And can you speak
Right.
more to like how it shows up with this deficiency?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the individual and where that deficiency might happen. So, as I'd mentioned, like vitamin D deficiency could be one individual, it could be insomnia, it could be reduced bone density, it could be insulin resistance, right? There are different, it depends on what's going on with that person's health and their issues and some of their lifestyle factors as to where that magnesium deficiency is targeting that individual. But I think too, when we're looking at magnesium, it's important to kind of know what magnesium deficiency, like what is actually depleting our magnesium, because
Yes.
it's important, because if you're supplementing and you're depleting it just as quickly, you're really not getting ahead. And you'll sometimes often hear individuals say, well, I'm taking magnesium and I still feel like whatever, tired
Yeah.
or can't sleep. And then we have to kind of trask back and go, okay, so how much magnesium are you taking and how much are you losing at the same time? And I wish there was a great blood test that we could take to say, hey, this is like how much you have, but we don't have that. If we want to get really an accurate test, it's like muscle biopsy, because that's where most of or tissue biopsy, because the most of our magnesium is in the bones and tissues. Only 1% is in the blood, and that's what they're testing. So, of course, everybody who gets their serum magnesium tested is probably going to have sufficiency. And so then they're like, well, there's nothing wrong.
Oh
And
my gosh, yes.
yeah,
Someone
so
sent me
this,
their blood test of magnesium showing it was in a perfect range today
yes.
and said, do you think I really need to take this? And I was like, I know that, I said not all of our magnesium is in our blood and a better place to test for it, I thought would be hair, like a hair mineral analysis, but you're telling me it's muscle. So, so interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of been like the gold standard in the research if you look that up. Or there's also something called IV magnesium loading, where they load you with magnesium and they see how much is excreted or how much you don't excrete, and then they can tell. Those are kind of like the two gold standards, but you're not going to, those are invasive methods, right? You're not going to probably send people for that.
Yeah.
But what you are going to do is you can look at, okay, are these people on medications that deplete magnesium? Are they on PPIs? Are they on statins? Are they on birth control? Are they on, like, there's so many things that we can look at. Diuretics, right? Antibiotics. Do they use a lot of antibiotics? Because we know that they all are big depleters of magnesium. Are they sugar addicts? Do they have a sugar issue? Are they insulin resistant? That's depleting magnesium because the kidneys are responsible for eliminating magnesium. And so when you have an insulin resistance issue, we see that happening, or a kidney issue. You know, do they like sugar? Sugar is going to deplete magnesium. Are they stressed? Stress is going to deplete magnesium. Yes, it helps stress responses, but if you're depleted and you're stressed, then you're using up all of your magnesium. So usually what I do in practice is I look at, okay, how much are they taking, and how many factors do they have where they could potentially be depleting their magnesium, and we kind of look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, that is very eye-opening to see all these potential depleters of magnesium, because when I talk to people, a lot of them do know. They're like, "Yeah, I am taking magnesium." I'm like, "How many are you like what are you taking? How much are you taking?" Just one capsule at night. And so that's usually what I get, or like one scoop of my magnesium powder at night. And I always say like, I'd love to learn from you and refine my recommendations, but I know that things like stress and sugar and things like that deplete our magnesium. So we're burning it up throughout the day, or I don't know if that's the right term to use, or excreting it. So we're utilizing this magnesium and in a deficient state all day long. And so to me, I would recommend to take it more, like take it throughout the day, maybe at meal times to help with the absorption, because we get the stomach acid to help absorb the minerals perhaps. And I'm open to like hearing your feedback on this. This is what I've been recommending. And so taking it at the meal times throughout the day, so then we can support our body's need for it throughout the day. Is that, how would you
Yeah,
refine that?
yeah, because low stomach acid is like later in life, we have less stomach acid, which is why we see elderly or older individuals, they have absorption issues when it comes to magnesium. So if you have low stomach acid, you might not actually even be absorbing the magnesium that you're taking. Or if you have GI issues, right? So inflammation in the GI, so like IBD or Crohn's colitis, those types of things, again, we're having absorption issues. So we would probably, A, want to look at trying to improve absorption.
Hmm.
And B, yeah, we want to bring it, we don't want to kind of take all our magnesium at once, because it's a lot on the kidney too, right? Because it has to be excreted by the kidney. This is how magnesium gets out of the body, right? And so taking it, throughout the day can be a better solution. The other thing, and we'll probably talk about forms of magnesium
Yes.
and stuff like that later on, but you know, magnesium's a fairly big like molecule that like they attach it to either a glycine or a citrate or a 3 and 8, and those are big molecules. And so we usually don't see more than 150 to 200 milligrams of magnesium in a capsule. And there's a reason for that, because that is how much can be held in a capsule, but that's really the ideal kind of what our body can kind of handle in one load. And so I usually don't dose more than 200. Sometimes I will if they're really depleted, but it's usually spread out through the day, and it just allows for, because we're using it up throughout the day, right? We want to kind of be repleting it throughout the day. A simple thing like going to the gym and sweating, you're losing magnesium through the sweat, right? So if you took your magnesium at 9 a.m., all of it, and you went and worked out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you kind of like lost however much through sweat, you really don't have enough probably in the system at that point to kind of get you through the rest of the day until the next morning. So that could be a good example of how we can quickly get out of having enough magnesium.
Yeah, that's great. Super helpful. And so you started to mention some impacts with like how blood sugar, insulin, and magnesium are connected, how they impact each other. Can we start to unravel and get a little bit more specific about how how blood sugar and insulin are impacted by magnesium or the lack of, and vice versa, and how magnesium can help these things?
Yeah, and there's actually anybody who's like a little bit more into research might want to even read this. It's actually really interesting. But there's the Nurses' Health Study, which is a huge study, and they have a ton of participants in the study. And so they looked at magnesium intake and insulin resistance, and they found, like, their conclusion was that a higher intake of magnesium is associated with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and that was kind of what their conclusion was. But as we know, when we have elevated insulin in our system, then eventually our cells stop responding, and there's like this overload, and that's kind of what we call insulin resistance. And research has shown that those insulin receptors depend on magnesium to function properly and to respond to that insulin. So if we're magnesium deficient, right away our receptors are not as receptive to actually the glucose, and this is a problem. And we see this with a lot of type 2 diabetics. And often when we replete magnesium and we change their diet, we see really good changes happening, especially in type 2 diabetes. And in that study, that's kind of what they did. And they saw really great results. But here's the kicker with insulin resistance, because what they also found was that the people that had insulin resistance was that they were actually excreting more urinary magnesium in their, like, by their kidneys, right? So they were actually depleting their magnesium, their body's level of magnesium. And so what that basically tells us is that yes, a magnesium deficiency can cause insulin resistance or insulin not to be as receptive, but we also know that elevated insulin is actually going to make us lose more magnesium in the urine. And so it's this vicious cycle that kind of goes back and forth, and unless you kind of crack that cycle, we're going to be stuck in this perpetuating loop that just keeps going.
Wow, that is so interesting, and I love hearing that sort of the bidirectional relationship of the magnesium and the insulin resistance. So I heard, and I would love to hear if this is true, that I heard that for every molecule of glucose, the body needs 54 molecules of magnesium to process it. Is that accurate?
It's roughly.
Roughly accurate?
Yeah. So for every molecule of glucose, we need 54 molecules of magnesium. There are studies that say 36. There are studies that say 60-ish. I would probably
It's still a
average
lot.
it out. Yes. It's
Yes.
more than one, right?
It's
And
more
so
than, yeah.
right? So if you're
Yes.
having a lot of sugar, you are definitely blowing through magnesium. Like, that's just the way it is. And that's probably why when we're looking at insulin, because it is a sugar problem, it's not specifically you eating sugar, but the body is still having to deal with sugar and getting it out of the blood and into the cells or into the liver or into the muscle cells or fat tissue, right? So it's still a sugar issue, but you can see how that can deplete magnesium, but then in the same turn, it actually makes insulin resistance worse, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. So, yeah, I just see there's so many indications for this because we know that sleep issues, if someone is not sleeping well, they're going to have issues with insulin resistance. And if they're low in magnesium, they may not sleep well. And then that would cause insulin resistance. And so it's just, I see this whole thing spiraling negatively, but then with the addition of with the magnesium, properly dosing it, and we can talk about foods next, but we can see that we can start spiraling things in the right direction as we work on all of these things together.
Right, right. It's our body does not work in isolation, right?
No.
And we know that everything is connected. Um, you know, just a simple thing like weight loss is not just about diet and exercise. It's about the sleep, it's about the stress, it's about, making sure you're correcting deficiencies. It's about exercise. Like it's not just one component. And so we have to remember that even with like magnesium, right? Like we
Yeah.
have to remember that it's one component to an entire picture. So there's not always just one thing that's going to work.
Yeah. So let's talk about foods. You mentioned a couple before, but let's talk about food sources of magnesium. And I would love for you to touch on if what what I heard is that our soils are becoming so depleted that our foods now have so much less magnesium, and that's why basically everyone needs to supplement. Would you say that that's like a somewhat like how true is that statement?
Yes, you're right. So we do have a lot of soil erosion. We have a lot of contamination, right? Heavy metals in the soil. And so that is going to strip minerals, and that's not going to get to the plant. And of course, that's not going to, once it's not in the plant, we're not going to get it either. And so does that mean there's no minerals in the food? No. Does it mean we have less minerals in the food? Yes. For most people, I would say food is probably not going to be enough to get you where you want to be with magnesium levels, unless you live like a really straight life. No sugar, no stress, no, because you have to remember that you have to keep those things in mind because that's depleting your magnesium all the time, right? And so if you are on any one of the medications, you are constantly being depleted. And you would have to be eating very specific foods and lots of it to actually even meet the recommended dietary allowance, which is 300 to 420 milligrams per day. Now, and we also have to keep in mind that's the minimum we need, right? And is the RDA actually going to be sufficient? I would say in most cases, no. Because the RDA for magnesium was last looked at in 1997. And when we look at how they come up with the RDA, it's based on body weight. And the body weight is different from 1997 to today by about 30 pounds. So, yeah, so they actually did a study a couple of years ago where they looked at what the new RDA should be. And it was like supposed to be somewhere around 150 to 200 milligrams more than where it's at right now. Wow. So is the 300 to 420-ish milligrams per day enough? Probably not. But I never discourage food. So I always say, you know what? It's a nice added bonus, right? So yes, we won't get a lot of it, but it's an added bonus. And a lot of the foods that magnesium is in are plant foods. So they're going to be good for us, right? So they're going to be like our leafy greens, our pumpkin seeds, our flax seeds, our chia seeds, avocados, salmon, dark chocolate, nuts, fatty fish like mackerel and halibut and those kinds of things, quinoa. So a lot of plant foods are in there. And I mean, I'd say probably the best bang for your buck would be your pumpkin seeds, right? So you could probably get around 250 milligrams of magnesium in a quarter cup of pumpkin seeds. So that would be your biggest bang, but I don't know if someone wants to eat pumpkin seeds all the time, right? So, but you can definitely, like I said, it's a great addition and it would not hurt, right? So,
Yeah, that's true. And what about the idea of like supplementing a mineral in isolation? Like, is this throwing off our calcium? Like, if we're all just taking tons of magnesium, what are the effects of that?
well, that's an interesting point that you bring that up because we actually consume way more calcium than we actually probably realize. And I technically do not put anybody on calcium supplements unless they absolutely need to. And in that respect, I would put it into a bone formula if they had something like osteopenia or osteoporosis. And the reason I don't do that is because we actually get so much calcium from our foods, even if you're dairy free. And that calcium, if you don't have enough magnesium and that calcium is coming in, you are going to not be able to break down that calcium. And then that does not fare well because you're going to end up with stones or calcifications in the arteries, spurs, right? So this is kind of what's happening. And when I see certain patients, they will have coming in and they're using lots of calcium supplements. They don't have magnesium. They got some vitamin D coming in. Well, that's not going to help because vitamin D is also going to have that calcium component. So it just adds more problems sometimes to the picture. So am I worried about calcium being out? No, not at all. Potassium is also much more prevalent in our foods in much higher doses. So I don't worry too much about potassium unless I actually see a potassium level that is low on blood work, which we can sometimes see. And we can be very specific with food and actually bring that potassium back up. But those types of minerals, they're not responsible for as many things as this one mineral has to do. And so, and they don't get depleted in the same way. Like they're not being shut down. Calcium, you're not depleting as much calcium if you're insulin resistant. You know what I mean?
Like or from sugar.
It's a different ratio. Yeah.
Okay.
And so those, like, I'm not too worried about the other minerals when it comes to looking at something in isolation. Now, obviously, like a multivitamin or a multi-mineral is going to have a little bit of everything, but a lot of the times it's not enough for therapeutic dosing.
Yeah. So that's really helpful because I've been giving magnesium. I've been taking magnesium and I'm like, am I, messing things up by just doing the single mineral? So happy to learn that. And so I would love to talk about the different forms of magnesium. I know there's many different, like you mentioned before, like the glycinate, the citrate, and then there's also different forms of taking magnesium. So there's Epsom salt baths, there's sprays, there's lotions, there's oils, there's all sorts of things. So can we dive into all these different forms? And I know that some of them have different benefits. So maybe we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's one thing with magnesium. There's lots of forms.
Yeah.
I think there's like 18, but we will only go over the ones that you will actually find in a health food store. Because some of this is used in hospitals, right? So in preeclampsia or like in medical conditions, they're using magnesium. And so those things aren't really available to everybody. So we won't talk about those. But the ones that you're going to find in health food stores, bisglycinate or glycinate. So they're both on the exact same thing, just some companies will drop the bis. And so,
I did not know that.
So you'll see magnesium glycinate and then you'll see magnesium bisglycinate. It's still a glycine molecule that is attached to that magnesium. And so I like to think of that magnesium as a great all-around magnesium form. It kind of touches on a lot of different aspects, but it's most known for calming. It's most known for helping with sleep, pain, anxiety, tight muscles, because it's just everything is kind of relaxing with glycine. And so it's kind of, if you have more than one thing that you want to kind of target, glycinate or bisglycinate is really a good option. And it's quite absorbable. It's highly absorbable, actually, and it's quite well tolerated. So you don't often get like the loose bowel movements or the stomach upset or those kinds of things that you can sometimes see with magnesium supplements. So this one has been clinically tested and researched in lots of different things: high blood pressure, endometriosis. It's got a lot of restless legs, bone health, a lot of research behind those clinical applications. The next one we have is citrate. So citrate is, it has good bioavailability, meaning that you're going to absorb it, which is important. I love it for constipation. It draws water into the colon. It helps to kind of get things moving. I love dosing it at night for a lot of people so that it can do what it needs to do overnight, and then the mornings are much better. I also use it in acid reflux. It helps to keep the esophageal sphincter down, and so I like using it in there. There's lots of research on migraines with citrate specifically, and obviously some people will still use it for sleep and stress management. However, the drawback with citrate is at higher doses, it can cause loose bowel movements. So if you have like loose bowel movements, you're probably going to get some GI upset as well. So usually with citrate, we do a titration if we have to get to high enough levels, and we kind of get people up there slowly to avoid that. Then we have L-threonate. So L-threonate is really probably one of the newer forms of magnesium on the block. And this form is special because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. And it specifically powers the brain. So it's a great supplement if you're looking at cognitive function, memory, learning, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, those kinds of things. And it's also been researched for brain plasticity. So they took cognitive decline patients and put them on it for 12 weeks, and they measured their cognitive function at the beginning and at the end, and they actually reversed their cognitive health by 9 years. 9 years in 12 weeks. So
Whoa.
It really does a
Amazing.
lot for the brain. Yeah. So love that for, like I said, any type of cognitive issue that might be going on. And then malate is another great form of magnesium that I use a lot. It's really great for people who have tender points, muscle soreness, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, because it drives up the energy cycle. So it's got malic acid in there, which is part of the Krebs cycle. So it actually increases energy. And so we use it a lot for that. And it has some extra special things, so it helps with oral health as well, and detoxifying aluminum from the body. It pulls the aluminum out, so I've used it for that as well. So it's kind of got some stuff that you would not think that magnesium would be responsible for. Yeah.
I have that form at home, and so I'm excited about that because I did some sort of a test and it said I'm high in aluminum. I know they're spraying the skies with aluminum. There's a lot of, aluminum foil. I used to use aluminum deodorant, not anymore, but, maybe
Right.
those things. So that's really, really interesting to know. I love this.
Yeah.
Keep going. I'm loving it.
Yeah. And then we have the magnesium oils and spray. So these are great topical applications. The only drawback with topical applications is we don't know how much that individual actually absorbs. So it's different. There's no real clear research that says if you use 2 pumps of this, you're getting 300 milligrams of magnesium. So most of these topical sprays and oils will have a somewhat of a value associated with it, but unfortunately it's not the same for everybody. They have to do that for printing and for manufacturing and labeling, for Health Canada or for any health, for the government or whoever runs your health labels, right? So it's kind of a requirement. But we know that you do absorb something. So it's again, I wouldn't rely on it as like an only source. And I would do it with in addition. But they are good for things like restless legs, menstrual cramps, tightness, soreness, those kinds of things. Sometimes if I have an IBD client, like somebody who has Crohn's or colitis, who is maybe more geared to very diarrhea, loose stool kind of thing, I will get them to use the topical versus an actual supplement because we don't want to obviously increase what's going on, right? So this is a much more gentler application, and we know we're going to absorb something, but they're still getting some of that benefit. And then there's Epsom salt baths, right? So this is another topical way that you can get your magnesium. And of course it helps with stress, and it's like, a great way to relax. And it does also muscle soreness and tightness and stuff like that. And here you can actually get the salts, or you can actually get the flakes. So there's a difference there, and it's still they're two different magnesiums, but it still works in the same capacity. So some companies will have the salts itself, and then some companies will have like the magnesium flakes. And so the salts is sulfate, and then the flakes are chloride, right? So, and then some of the trace minerals sometimes also will use magnesium chloride in the liquid formula. So you can get these trace mineral drops, which will have quite a bit of magnesium in them, more than you would see in a multi-mineral. And so that's another good way of getting in some magnesium, because chloride is usually used in the liquid formats of magnesium.
Oh, okay. And are there any specific benefits associated with the chloride form?
It comes from the sea, right? So it has a lot of the same, like, muscle soreness. It's very good at repleting magnesium, especially if you're a bit low. But it does a lot of the same benefits. So it's going to help with sleep. It's going to help with tightness and all of those kinds of things. You won't get very specific results like the bisglycinate would or something like that, but it's definitely good for repleting. I like using it, and sometimes I will use it in trace mineral formulas just to get people to get it up, so we can get like a boost, and then we'll go on to more supplementation.
Yeah, I usually, for my clients, especially because most of us are working on improving blood sugar and insulin, and there's some lowering of the carbs, and then just people are super minerally depleted. So I'm usually recommending a trace mineral supplement, like a 40,000 volts by Trace Minerals or something like that. And then in addition, I also give them oral magnesium to take. I'll usually do a glycinate. If they struggle with constipation, we do work on the root causes of that. So potentially they need stomach acid, bile flow, but we'll use like the citrate or citrate in just as a temporary helper, because it's really important to be moving your bowels every day. So as we're working on that, we want that helper to support with that. And then, super interesting about the other forms and their uses. And so I do have a question. Are there forms that you don't recommend, and why?
So So sometimes we have to, okay, so the first thing I want to address is these combination formulas. So you'll
Okay.
see
Yes.
magnesium combo formulas where they'll have anywhere from 3 to 7 different types of magnesium in them. And as long as they are formulated properly, there's usually not anything wrong with that. But if you're trying to look at treating something specifically, you're likely not getting the therapeutic dose of whatever that form is that you need and in those combos because they're giving you a little bit of everything. So if you
Mm-hmm.
want to kind of have a little bit of everything, then that's okay. But if you're really looking at trying to do something and let's say constipation is your thing, then you're not going to get the therapeutic dose of citrate where it's going to work in the same manner. However, a lot of these combos include magnesium oxide. And a lot of these combos do not list the individual amounts for these magnesium,
Mm-hmm.
whatever they've got in there, the 5 forms or 4 forms or whatever, how many forms they have. And so as a practitioner, I have called the manufacturer and said, okay, how much of this magnesium, because they do have to reveal that. They don't have to actually put it on the label because they can call it a proprietary blend or they can just say, magnesium and then have all the forms and then just say 300 milligrams. And so what you have to want to be careful of is that it's not primarily oxide because oxide is a very cheap and inexpensive magnesium form and they like to use it because it's not going to cost a lot of money. Threonate, bisglycinate, these are more expensive forms of magnesium and so it's going to cost more. So we really want to make sure that those formulas do not primarily contain oxide because you could have a formula that has 80% oxide and 20% of the bisglycinate, malate, or whatever else they have put in there. So that is a caution when you're looking at these formulas where they've put more than one magnesium in.
And why not oxide?
We don't want oxide because we can't absorb it. So oxide is a fantastic laxative if you are really backed up. It's also what they use when you do a colonoscopy prep in high doses, right? So they mix it with the citrate and this is what you are given. So if I have somebody who is very constipated, has not had bowel movements for days, I will use oxide because it works really well and I don't have to worry about how much they're absorbing because we absorb less than 5% of that magnesium. So I have dosed it very high to get things moving and I'm not too concerned with overabsorption of magnesium. And so that's why we don't want to use oxide. So that would be its only purpose.
Yeah.
Do not use oxide for, just regular magnesium intake because it's not doing much. It's also the form that medical doctors will recommend all the time. They will tell you to go and get magnesium oxide. And I don't know if that's just what they learned in school. Maybe they did. But this is the form that they will, and it's usually very inexpensive. And so you can pick it up at any pharmacy. That's where most of these oxide formulas are. So it's available to general public. They don't have to go to a health food store or a store where they do just supplements. And then the other one is probably magnesium hydroxide. And that's, again, we're just looking at more, it's a little bit more absorbable than the oxide, but we're in the same boat. It's not doing a lot. We don't absorb it very well. Also causes a lot of GI issues. Not a form that I would probably put my money on. They have it in a lot of the antacids, right? So they use that in there. So probably not something that we want to be taking. But I do have one caution, like with magnesium, and that is, so anybody who has like kidney issues, any type of kidney, renal, maybe kidney disease or renal dysfunction, you have to be careful with magnesium because that's how we excrete magnesium. And so
Okay.
those individuals should always be followed by a healthcare provider if they're using magnesium, because the dosing for magnesium that we would be using versus what they would be using is very different. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I was aware of that about the proprietary blend, and I was aware, like my suspicions were confirmed about magnesium oxide, low absorption. 5% is really bad. So that's pretty bad. And there's a specific company that has reached out to me and asked to work with me, and they have a blend of magnesium, and I looked and I saw a proprietary blend. I saw magnesium oxide listed, and I said, no, I bet you this supplement is, they're trying to save money, and I will not work with that company. And I know they treat their affiliates well and all that. I'm like, yeah, they probably have the means to, because they're making out like bandits on this. And so
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that realness, so we can all get supplements that are effective, because that's, we want to move the needle, and this is a really important thing that we want to be absorbing. So thank you for sharing that.
And just one more thing. So
Please.
if a company is using, sometimes they will use oxide in these, proprietary blends, whatever, but the companies that are actually using it to buffer the different forms of magnesium, they will note that on the thing, because there are a couple companies that are out there that will, at the bottom, it'll be in brackets and it's noted as oxide being used as a buffer. Now in that case, it's okay, because the buffer means that they've just put in a little bit to buff out all of the, remember, oxide is a smaller molecule than all the other molecules that we have magnesium with. So that's why you can buy a magnesium oxide capsule that's 1,000 milligrams or 500 milligrams. You would never see that with any other magnesium forms on their own. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll put a little bit of oxide in there and use it as a buffer in order to allow all those other forms. But that is usually stated. And the ones that don't state it, we have to be careful. And if you're really, like, you can always call the company, but if they're not upfront about it, it's already a red flag. So
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I actually just got a message a day or two ago and on Instagram, and I have not responded to this person yet because I don't know the answer to it. And I was like, oh, what a perfect opportunity. She said, can anyone in this page tell me why I have such a paradoxical response to magnesium, why it makes me not be able to sleep and it makes me anxious. Have you heard of that happening?
Yes.
Okay.
In some individuals, they actually get the opposite response. And so it's just the way that their body, their receptors are working. And in those individuals, we usually have to either pair it with something. Sometimes I will pair it with GABA. Sometimes I'll pair it with like a B6, and we have to bring it in mega or micro small doses, and we dose it. And I've had patients where we've done very, very small dosing, like 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams. And after several months, we've been able to get them up to like a 250 milligram or 300 milligram. But it has to be done properly, and you kind of need to understand why that person is responding that way. Like, why is that receptor responding? Do they have different stress levels? Do they have sleep issues? Like, you kind of got to look at their lifestyle factors, because that's going to give you a hint as to why the body is responding the way that it is. And sometimes it's just genetics, right? Like, sometimes you just have a genetic disposition where you don't respond well to something like that. But you can kind of work around that most times. And in those individuals, I'm really loading them with their food magnesiums, because we want to make sure that we're getting in at least the RDA. Okay. That's the minimum, right? We got to get at least that in. But yes, so you can you can find that with some individuals.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I will obviously just send her to your page because I will
Yeah.
let the expert handle it. And maybe she would want to work with you to help figure that out and ask those deeper questions. So
Yeah.
that's perfect, perfect. So, how do we know how much to take? I know you sort of started talking about this. Can you give us any sort of guidelines? I know that obviously it's got to be bio-individualized, but any sort of information there?
Yeah, so obviously, as I mentioned, the RDA is minimum. So we want to make sure we're at least getting that, if anything. And then it's really about that person's lifestyle. So, like I said, I usually look at, okay, so here's all my depleters, here is kind of what their symptoms are, and then I kind of come up with a dose. But I would say mostly somewhere between 400 milligrams and 800 milligrams is kind of where I put most people. But again, it depends on their lifestyle, their health history, because everybody's going to be different, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I know the bottle says take one capsule twice a day, and they're usually covering the RDA amount is usually what the supplement companies do. But outside of that, that's may not be enough for whatever the issue is that's going on. But I would say most supplementation is in that range. And then, like I said, sometimes the oxide is a little bit higher because we need a little bit more aggressiveness, but it's never long term, and it's never with something that's more absorbable.
Gotcha. And so I feel like we had a very comprehensive discussion. Is there anything that you feel like that that we missed, some misconceptions, something important for people to know?
Yeah, I think that probably the three biggest misconceptions for magnesium is that it doesn't play the role that it does in our health. And I know it's a mineral. And I know, people just look at it like maybe like every other mineral, but it does do so many things in our body. And if you just go to PubMed and research and just type in magnesium, it's 120,000 plus studies. So there's a reason there's that many, right? So they have looked at it in almost every capacity because of these enzymatic reactions. And here's the thing, 5, 10 years ago, we only knew about 300 of them. So
Wow.
in the last, I think the first time it was actually recorded in research was in 2016. So not that long ago, where we've come up with 300 more reactions that we didn't even know about prior to that. So that would be my first misconception. And then obviously, not all magnesium supplements are the same, right? So we kind of covered that. There's different forms, there's different bioavailabilities, there's different absorption rates, and of course, there's different forms that we don't want in certain supplements. And probably the third misconception is that magnesium deficiency is rare. I hear this a lot. Oh, it's rare. Everybody has normal magnesium, and that's true because they're testing 1% of our magnesium in our body. And so if you miss 99%, you're probably not going to see a lot of deficiency numbers when they're testing serum magnesium. And so that is probably the biggest misconception out of all three of those.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. Yes, so good. So where can people find more from you and get in touch with you?
Probably the best place is on Instagram. That's where I spend most of my time, and I'm just at my name, Dr. Barb Woegerer. And I have a lot of information there on magnesium. I've written a couple of ebooks on magnesium, one that's more general about the mineral, and then I've also released an ebook on all the different forms. So I go into detail with all the different forms of magnesium. So, yeah.
Oh, Great. Awesome. So we will have everything linked in the show notes. And thank you so much for taking your time and educating us all today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for letting me come on here and
Yeah.
create awareness around this amazing mineral.